All right, let's jump right in. If you crack open a standard history book to the year 1914, you're usually handed a very neat, almost cinematic story about how World War I started. You probably picture it. June 28th, a driver makes a fateful wrong turn in Sarajevo, a 19-year-old steps out of the crowd, and Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated. It's a simple, romanticized narrative, right? One bullet, one empire gets furious, alliances fall like dominoes, and boom, the world is at war. But in this explainer, we are going to completely shatter that simplistic myth, because the actual truth behind why the world went to war, it's far colder, it's incredibly mechanical, and it is deeply, deeply embedded in economics.
There's a brilliant historical consensus that really hits the nail on the head here. Gavrilo Princip did not cause World War I. He was a trigger, not a cause. And you know, that distinction is absolutely massive. Princip was the match, sure, but the room he threw that match into had been systematically, deliberately soaked in fuel for over 30 years. We're talking about massive shifts in steel production, a frantic grab for colonial trade routes, exploding naval budgets, and gigantic railway concessions. The entire underlying architecture of European capitalism had been quietly building towards a war that frankly everyone was already preparing for.
So, I want you to think about this. What if the trigger wasn't the cause? Seriously, if you entirely removed Franz Ferdinand from that car, if that driver never took that wrong turn, that overwhelming economic, industrial, and financial pressure sitting right underneath Europe, it wasn't going anywhere. Germany was still outproducing everyone in steel. Britain was still absolutely terrified of losing its naval supremacy. France was still sitting on billions in Russian debt. The pressure was going to explode eventually. Sarajevo just gave the great powers a really convenient excuse to finally release it.
Okay, let's get into Section 1, the industrial flip.
To really understand how we got to the brink, we have to travel back to Germany in the late 19th century, right after it unified. They experienced a completely unprecedented economic explosion. Think about this. Back in 1870, Britain was cranking out roughly 3 times as much steel as Germany. They were the undisputed kings of the industrial age. But fast forward just 40 years to 1910, Germany somehow skips the slow, century-long buildup and rockets straight into advanced, rapid industrialization. In just 4 decades, the entire industrial hierarchy of Europe completely flipped upside down. You now had Germany producing nearly double the steel of the UK.
Now, a booming economy of that massive size literally cannot exist in a vacuum, which brings us to Kaiser Wilhelm II and his famous demand for a place in the sun. It sounds kind of poetic, doesn't it? But in reality, it was just a blunt, aggressive economic necessity. Germany desperately needed captive markets. They needed raw materials like rubber and cotton, and they needed a navy large enough to protect all those new trade routes. They were producing at a staggering scale, but they'd arrived at the imperial table decades after Britain and France had already carved up most of the globe. They needed resources, and that pushed them straight into a dangerous, high-stakes scramble for territory.
Which brings us to Section 2, the business of war. So, what exactly happens when Germany's rapid, hungry industrial ambition runs headfirst into the world's leading superpower? Well, in 1906, Britain launches the HMS Dreadnought. This ship was meant to lock in their absolute naval dominance once and for all. But it actually backfired in a spectacular way. It accidentally reset the entire naval balance of power back to zero. See, the Dreadnought was so advanced and so heavily armored that it made literally every existing warship on the planet instantly obsolete, and yes, that included Britain's own massive fleet. Ironically, this meant Germany didn't have to spend decades catching up to British shipbuilding. They could just start from scratch, using those massive new steel mills we just talked about to match Britain dreadnought for dreadnought.
And this brings up a deeply unsettling reality about this arms race, profiting from panic. By 1909, the British public was whipped into absolute mass hysteria. People were literally marching in the streets chanting, "We want 8 and we won't wait," demanding more ships. And who profited from all this fear? Private, publicly traded armaments firms. You had Vickers and Armstrong Whitworth in Britain, Krupp over in Germany. Remember, there were practically zero conflict of interest laws back then. These companies actually had interlocking directorships. They shared patents across hostile borders. They sold weapons to opposing sides and effectively sold international tension to their shareholders as a highly profitable product. Escalating the conflict was incredible for business. Cooling things down? Not so much.
Moving on to Section 3, Infrastructure and Energy Paranoia.
While the tension was boiling over on the high seas, an equally massive struggle was happening on land over the resources needed to power these vast empires. This led to one of the most destabilizing infrastructure projects in modern history. Picture this. On one hand, you have the traditional British sea route to India. This was the fragile, vital artery of their entire empire,
completely reliant on the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal. On the other hand, you have the new Berlin-Baghdad Railway. This was a wildly audacious overland route stretching deep into the Ottoman Empire, aiming right for the Persian Gulf. If completed, German goods and military assets could just bypass British waterways entirely. It made the Royal Navy's famous choke points completely irrelevant, directly threatening the core of British imperial security.
Now watch how quickly this situation escalates thanks to Winston Churchill's fateful pivot in 1912. As First Lord of the Admiralty, he makes the massive high-stakes decision to convert the Royal Navy from reliable domestic coal to faster, more efficient oil. But the second he does this, Britain instantly loses its domestic fuel independence. They were sitting on mountains of coal, but they had almost zero oil. Suddenly, almost overnight, national survival required securing and controlling Middle Eastern oil fields just to keep their fleet floating.
And then, right here in 1914, literally just months before the war breaks out, the consequences of that pivot become undeniable. The British government takes a direct, unprecedented majority stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. I want you to connect the dots with me here. Britain's state oil interests were now violently converging on the exact same physical territory, Persia and Mesopotamia, where German engineers and financiers were laying down the tracks for the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. You've got two massive, paranoid industrial giants locked on a collision course over the exact same patch of ground.
All right, Section 4, the capitalist web. Now you might be wondering, where exactly was the cash coming from for all these railways and dreadnoughts and oil concessions? It came from foreign investment. Take a look at France. By 1914, roughly 25% of all French foreign investment was tied up exclusively in Russian debt. We are talking about ordinary French middle-class savers, doctors, shopkeepers, retired military officers who were essentially underwriting the Franco-Russian military alliance out of their own pockets. This meant the alliance wasn't just some polite diplomatic handshake, it was built on cold, hard cash. France literally could not afford to let Russia's economy collapse or lose a war, because doing so would completely wipe out the wealth of the French middle class. The bond market and the military treaties were now totally inextricable. Finally, Section 5, the unstoppable machine. When you weave all of these threads together, the industrial competition, the naval arms races, the oil concessions, and these massive tangled bond networks, you get a rigid system that simply has no off switch. And we definitely cannot ignore the domestic side of this equation either. In 1914, every single major European power was dealing with massive internal instability that had absolutely nothing to do with Sarajevo. Russia was facing severe labor unrest. Germany's aristocratic rulers were terrified by the rising Social Democratic Party. France was politically fractured, and Austria-Hungary was literally tearing itself apart from multi-ethnic nationalist movements. For the conservative elites running these countries, a short, unifying external war looked incredibly convenient. It was a patriotic pressure valve, right? A way to distract a very restless population.
But here is the ultimate trap that made disaster practically inevitable. Speed was survival. Take Germany's Schlieffen Plan. It demanded an immediate, perfectly timed lightning strike through Belgium. There was absolutely no room for a pause, no chance for a diplomatic cooling-off period. Moving millions of troops and supplies required rigid, mechanical train schedules. And once those trains started rolling, military planners explicitly told their national leaders that the machinery literally could not be stopped without causing total chaos. This highly industrialized, incredibly complex war machine stripped Europe's leaders of the one thing they needed most in a crisis: time. 17 million. That is the staggering, heartbreaking human death toll of this conflict. I want you to contrast this massive, horrific loss of life with the cold, calculated, entirely rational balance sheet decisions of the previous 3 decades that we've just explored. The real tragedy of 1914 isn't that a bunch of cartoon villains got into a smoky room and planned a world war for profit. It's that ordinary, self-interested economic decisions, repeated over and over across decades, built a massive mechanical beast. And nobody could stop it once that assassination in Sarajevo finally gave it a reason to start moving.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a question to really chew on. Looking back at all of this, which economic thread do you think was the true culprit here? Was it Germany's rapid, aggressive industrial ambition? Was it Britain's naval fear and their brand new dependency on oil? Maybe it was French finance irreversibly tying itself to Russia's fate? Or was it the quiet, constant profiteering of the arms industry? The really scary part is that the mechanisms of resource control, supply chain anxiety, and profiting from international tension, they didn't magically disappear in 1914. They are still humming away in our modern world right now. So which thread do you think mattered most?
Think about that, and I hope this gave you a completely new perspective on how economic forces truly trigger history.